Welcome everyone to the 2021 COVID edition of the Feminist Theory Workshop. I'm Jocelyn Olcott, the current director of the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies here at Duke University. This time last year, we were eagerly looking forward to record-breaking attendance for our 14th annual Feminist Theory Workshop, which was scheduled to open on March 20th of 2020. Although I'm eager to be able to resume activities in person, I'm deeply grateful to the Feminist Theory Workshop Committee, my colleagues Patrice Douglas, Frances Hasso, and Jennifer Nash, for making it possible to have these events remotely, and to Sharon Holland for being so game to give this new format a shot. Until last year, the Feminist Theory Workshop has convened every March since 2007, normally featuring 4 keynote speakers who recommend readings that we discuss in breakout seminars. We usually have participants from dozens of countries and hundreds of institutions around the world, including graduate students, independent scholars, and faculty at every rank. Meals and seminars give participants an opportunity to share their research and engage with diverse feminist theorists. Over the years, the lineup of keynote speakers has included, among many, many others, Hortense Spillers, Joan Kopchak, Donna Haraway, Patricia Williams, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, Jose Esteban Munoz, Wendy Brown, Sonia Alvarez, Lee Edelman, Letty Volp, Catherine McKittrick, Lauren Berlant, and C. Riley Snorton, and Sylvia Federici. In 2017, I had the opportunity to introduce Christina Crosby, whose book, A Body Undone, did as much as anything I've ever read to show how feminist theory helps us understand embodied experience. And although the current pandemic has inspired us to rethink what feminist theory might look like going forward, I'm excited to continue this intellectual tradition in some form and hopefully in person. Before I turn things over to Pete Siegel to introduce today's event, I want to thank a few people. First of all, the GSF staff have now planned this event twice in 2 radically different formats, having made all the arrangements for last year's FTW before it was called off. So Amanda Archambault, Jeremy Boomhauer, and especially Julie Winmore have worked tirelessly to make everything run so seamlessly. The Feminist Theory Workshop has also enjoyed generous support from many Duke departments, which are listed on the webpage for this event, along with our institutional co-sponsors who normally pay to send students and faculty to the Feminist Theory Workshop, and support from the Provost at Duke University and the Dean of Arts and Sciences. Also, since we have decided to spread the Feminist Theory Workshop over 3 Feminist Theory Fridays, we have 2 more events coming up this month. Shatima Threadcraft will be speaking on gendered necropower, abolition feminism, and Black Death's public-private divide at the same time on March 19th, so next Friday. And the following Friday, Gayatri Gopinath will be speaking on unruly visions, the queer regional imaginaries of Sunil Gupta and Agha Shahid Ali on March 26th. We hope that you can all join us again for both of those. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague, Pete Siegel.
So it's such an honor to introduce Sharon Holland and Jennifer Nash. Since I need to be far too brief, I'm going to do away with most of the formalities here. It would take me too long just to read out all of the awards they have won. Instead, I want to show why I have such an academic crush on both of these 2 scholars. Sharon Holland, the Townsend Ludington term Distinguished Endowed Professor in American Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, has been a key figure in feminist theory, cultural studies, critical race theory, queer theory, Black studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, and so many other fields for at least 2 decades. Raising the Dead, Readings of Death and Black Subjectivity was a critical intervention in the links Holland developed between death and Blackness, links that so many others following her have taken up to develop such provocative scholarship. The erotic life of racism connected critical race theory to queer theory, showing the ways that both fields had abandoned the Black subject and Black women in particular, thus calling for a re-engagement with Black feminist theory. One of Holland's many noteworthy arguments that has stuck with me is the manner in which racism is based on a series of erotic connections at once denied, invalidated, and so very central to our psychic attachments. In the introduction to the book, Holland argues that, quote, even though every quotidian encounter bears witness to miscegenation's imprint, miscegenation remains an impossibility. We are still made to choose a category to state who our people are and to relate to one cultural mode of being over and against another, unquote. This key statement suggests the importance of the erotics of racism, and erotics that does work in all of our lives. In the current movement for racial justice, I think of Holland's book as a call to activism, and Holland answers her own call. Just this year, she has developed a COVID-19 Queer, Trans, Indigenous People of Color Survival Fund, which has, or had as of several months ago, distributed over $46,000 in North Carolina. Holland will be in conversation with Jennifer Nash, the Jean Fox O'Barr Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke. Nash has been a significant influence on my own work since her 2008 publication of Strange Bedfellows, Black Feminism and Anti-Pornography Feminism, which she published while still in grad school. Then The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, found Black women's pleasures in the most unexpected place, mainstream hardcore heterosexual pornography, while Black Feminism Reimagined developed an extensive critique of intersectionality and a call for a reconsideration of the place of Black feminism within feminist theory. And though Black Feminism Reimagined just came out in 2019, Nash already has another forthcoming book, Birthing Black Mothers. I think you can all understand why I would have such an academic crush on these two amazing individuals who together have, along with others, brought joy and ecstasy into Black feminist theory. The work we'll hear today draws on Holland's engagement with Martin Heidegger's notion that humans die while animals perish, and reads across the theoretical spectrum of works on the human-animal distinction in order to arrive at a fundamental question. What is the relationship of Blackness to the discourse on the animal? Do Black humans die or perish? So, and we will end after Jennifer Nash engages with Sharon Holland, we will actually take questions in the question and answer section. So you have to put in your question within that section, and then Jennifer will read it to Sharon. So I hand this forum over then to Sharon Holland.
Wow, that was incredible. Thank you to everyone gathered here. Thank you to Julie Winmore, to Jocelyn Olcott, to Pete Siegel for that kind introduction. Jennifer Nash, my interlocutor, whose work inspires me always. Friends at GSF Studies at Duke, for this invitation to share my work, which is so meaningful to me. And I want to give the shout out to Ranji Khanna and Kathy Rudy, whose Animal Studies faculty grad seminar many years ago helped to shape this work. I have a little PowerPoint I would like to share that I'm going to do now. And I'll talk for about 10, well, really I'm lying, 10, 15 minutes really. Then open it up. Oops, sorry, got the wrong PowerPoint there. There we go. Another, a Black feminist consideration of animal life. In the beginning, I was writing a book called Vocabularies of Vulnerability. I wanted to cite all the ways in which Blackness and perhaps Black life could be taken in this worlding that we find ourselves in. Then I fell, a writer's euphemism for being bucked off of or politely deposited on the ground by a horse. And I shattered my left collarbone. In that moment, I discovered things about my body that I didn't know. I considered my own vulnerability to another. And perhaps more importantly for this work, I moved past my indebtedness to ontological modes of being and understanding, and began to see things through the prism of ethical relation. In this regard, I am perhaps signaling my yes to Levinas' critique of Heidegger's reliance upon ontology rather than ethics to understand the human condition. A critique that for Levinas does not quite withstand the hold that the human has upon our collective psyche. And signaling this move, the book aligns itself with discourses in animal studies and its attendant, but not always recognized, feminist critique. My inquiry is about relation rather than difference or its resolution. The book's organizing structure is peripatetic. I sniff the ground, following the scent of ordinary objects and the theoretical scaffolding they might build. I move into some territories and then abandoning them seemingly without care. I move into some and I tarry a little bit longer. Animal life is, after all, unreasonable and hard to manage. The 4 epigraphs for the book perhaps say more about its argument than this 15-minute synopsis can do, so I've put them up here. The first is from Sylvia Harris, who wrote the book. If you have a chance, please do read it. She's one of the winningest Black female jockeys in racing. Me, I have 2 rituals. I chant, and then before I mount the horse, I breathe him in. I know it sounds a little horse whisperish, but when I breathe in a horse, it's as if we are kindred souls. We are one. Tim Ingold, The Perception of the Environment. The distinction between the human and the non-human no longer marks the outer limits of the social world as against that of nature, but rather maps a domain within it whose boundary is both permeable and easily crossed. The third is from Barbara Smuts, reflecting on Coetzee's The Lives of Animals. For the heart to truly share another's being, it must be an embodied heart, prepared to encounter directly the embodied heart of another. I have met the other in this way, not once or a few times, but over and over during years spent in the company of persons like you and me, who happen to be non-human. And then my last epigraph. The difference between poetry and rhetoric is being ready to kill yourself instead of your children. I start with the last, a moment in Lord's 1978 poem that I could never quite parse when teaching her work. But a few lines that scholar, poet, and colleague and friend Maida Jones reminded me of as I was attempting to rework my first section of the book. My beginnings came to me in 2 scenes in Steve McQueen's film adaptation of Solomon Northrop's 1853 narrative, 12 Years a Slave. The first is the near hanging that Northrop endures, more protracted in the celluloid version than in print. The second is almost identical in the narrative in film and involves Northrop's whipping of an enslaved woman and friend, Patsy, at the overseer's request and in fear of his own life. In seeing these scenes of flesh as avatar and flesh as female, thinking of Spiller's here, and I quote, "A female body strung from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of field work, because the overseer standing the length of a whip has popped her flesh open, adds a lexical and living dimension to the narratives of women in society," end quote. I began to think about the ways in which we might be able to think of this scene laced through with hum animal indistinction as a moment that opens up another concern altogether. Perhaps that concern is, as Peter noticed earlier, how to have a brief for women, how to care for her. Questions from my second monograph. And in this manuscript, I took note of the fact that while we have asked and answered what white persons can do to Black persons, and the answer to that question is always already anything they want or can try. We have yet to consider the question nestled in the practices of enslavement, what to do when the overseer hands you the whip. Therefore, the problem that presented itself to me was not necessarily its afterlife, as in slavery's afterlife, but its contemporaneous question, one that sits in the air between the subject of the lash and the maker of its distinctive crack. Should I take the whip when offered to me? This is not a lesson for Black subjects. That seemed like an impossibility, but it could be a kind of lesson for our species, for a human being caught in the catch-22 of saving its own life at any cost. Into this space, Lord's damning line comes to full bloom, makes sense. The ethical question in this moment is structured in the hum animal distinction as the move to preserve the self's own life, a conundrum that Lord dispatches with a simple solution, suicide, is bound up, I would suggest, in our privileging of human being over and above all else. While going about the ethical practices of staying in that uncomfortable place, I returned to theoretical sightings of flesh and Black pessimism and began to wonder if, in thinking about flesh in my first book, that is Raising the Dead, which actually had its 20-year anniversary last year. I can't believe it. I keep looking at myself and going, how did this happen? I had somehow erred in believing that Toni Morrison's take on flesh in Beloved was indeed similar to Spiller's use of the same term in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, 1987. Had I indeed produced a rather queer misreading of flesh? I want to thank colleagues Dana Siedler and Dana Luciano for organizing that MLA panel in early 2020 that allowed me to flesh out this argument. In returning to the meaning and manner of flesh, its relationship to being and the enterprise of worlding, I went back, perhaps nostalgically so, to my undergraduate obsession with all things Merleau-Ponty. Yes, I was one of those students with a cigarette in one hand and the beret on my head and a very, very bad cappuccino at my elbow. And I came across the following quote: "My flesh and that of the world, therefore, involve clear zones, clearings," end quote. And perhaps my favorite, I quote again, and at some length: "The flesh is not matter, is not mind, is not substance. To designate it, we should need the old term element in the sense it was used to speak of water, air, earth, and fire. That is, in the sense of a general thing, midway between the spatio-temporal individual and the idea, a sort of incarnate principle that brings a style of being wherever there is a fragment of being. The flesh is in this sense an element of being," end quote. For baby Suggs in that clearing, the capitalized parts of Black bodies are made whole again through loving flesh, as perhaps an elemental predisposition. But I want to return back to Spiller's here, and in that oft quoted ending paragraph, 2 paragraphs of Mama's Baby. Quote again: "Only the female stands in the flesh, both mother and mother dispossessed. This problematizing of gender places her, in my view, out of the traditional symbolics of female gender. And it is our task to make a place for this different social subject. In so doing, we are less interested in joining the ranks of gendered femaleness than gaining the insurgent ground as female social subject," end quote. This same insurgency is remarked upon by Gayatri Spivak and Kenneth Subaltern Speak, and the 2 essays share close publication dates. In Spivak, it appears as gender prohibition, a space where, quote, "the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow," end quote. So, out of seeing flesh hanging or popped open, out of thinking through the question of what to do when the overseer hands you the whip, I began to wonder about that insurgent ground as female social subject, still female gender, but out of its traditional symbolics. I wondered about both mother and mother dispossessed, and I went in search of insurgencies and hum animal life as constitutive of a kind of radical embodiment, and found myself at Move's doorstep. And I want to give a shout out here to Michael Hames Garcia's work, which is amazing, where he talked briefly in the introduction about Move and their animal liberation work, and I had never heard of it. So I began to think about Move and animal life from that work, and so a shout out there. The work that I focus upon today comes from the second section, Companionate: Species. At this point, the project begins to turn in yet another direction, to track hum animal from the vantage point of practices of Black insurgency, an insurgency that pushed the limit of what is acceptable for our companionate species. And what I argue here in particular is that Haraway has obviously given us a real window on what companionate being with might be, but Move's work with animals was not so easy from the vantage point of others looking in on that work. What draws my attention to Move in Philadelphia is their consideration of the captivity of animals as a question well worth posing for the way humans live, and at the same time, how their intersectional agenda, Black liberation, animal liberation, took radical turns that were not always already acceptable to a human-centered public. Therefore, let us consider Move as that first American animal liberation group coming into the scene almost a full decade before PETA's founding in Rockville, Maryland in 1980, my hometown, by the way, and what they did with animals. Theirs is a philosophy for living that I want to argue had real and tragic consequences for their lives as Black people doing animal liberation. In fact, much of the literature about MOVE actually misnames their practice of being with animals. They were not a group overtly concerned with animal rights, so much as their stance on animals in captivity was a measure of their practice of obliterating through ethical action, the hum animal distinction and the modes of enslavement engendered by it in the sociocultural fabric of living. This being, becoming, and doing all point toward providing a kind of theory for that unbridgeable gap between Black being and human life at the center of Frank Wilderson's text on cinema, Red, White, and Black Cinema, the Structure of US Antagonisms. Wilderson's insistence, however, that the African descended being is, at the middle passage, an object, a slave, who can never be, a subject, is a property of human being that cordons off and reifies both species itself and the distinction between hum animal. This particular mode of life or living for Blackness is unsustainable. What MOVE allows us to see is the condition of enslavement for all beings, and through their experience of radical practice, they offer a way to challenge our critical focus upon the human for Blackness, while also providing, through their struggles to define their own reproductive lives, a way to tacitly apply Spiller's revolutionary work. In particular, Spiller's insistence that a culturally defined gender difference does not cohere for Black female subjects, whose reproductive capacity is a tool for the continuation of the objectivity of Blackness, is daunting. Nevertheless, in the end, there is that insurgent Black female New World subject. And the moment in Spiller's that I want to draw out here is this mother, right? The way in which reproduction comes into the text as a drag, as something to be accounted for, as a moment of relation. So this insurgent new Black female New World subject haunts the edges of Spiller's own astute assessments, and thus their utility for a kind of Black pessimist thought. In closing, I'll touch upon the other sections of the book very briefly. Diversity as scarcity moves from a brief consideration of diversity work on campus, and I want to thank Sarah Ahmed for her brilliant studies in this regard, and its strange parallel life and how we seem to understand the world around us, to a question about the known world. What can and cannot be known to us, for instance, in A Dog's Gaze off the page in Edward P. Jones's novel by that same name. It was in Jones's novel that I found that Heideggerian tension around perishment revived. In teasing out what can be known to us as humans about animal life, I then consider how the building blocks of hum-animal distinction are in difference, capacity, language, suffering. By taking up a few arguments by phenotypically white men, Agamben, Derrida, Levinas, just to name a few, on the way to mark distinction created through violence, but from the perspective of a particular grade 8 strike and its ramifications for understandings of relation and care, and Haraway's early work, Primate Visions, and Vanessa Woods' memoir about working among the bonobo in the Congo. I end this section with the consideration of puppies in the film Equilibrium, and just more broadly, culturally. The next section on food was scrapped due to COVID, but when I think about it, little can be done to top my colleague Keela Tompkins' brilliant book, Rachel, Indigestion. The next two sections focus in particular on horse cultures. Love, livestock, considers the LA film rebellion of the 70s and the production of films centering hum animal life and Blackness, especially Charles Burnett's short, The Horse from 1973, and his classic Killer of Sheep from 78. While my focus is on the hunt seat, for the most part, I do briefly look at another film which centers upon the Western saddle tradition, Cutting Horse by Larry Clark, with Haile Gerima as executive producer. The next section is Horse, flesh. And it thinks through barn and shed row cultures, born in the slaveocracy and still indebted to its lexicon. In the novels of Jamie Gordon, Circumspections of an Equestrian Statue from 1979, and Lord of Misrule from 2010, and C.E. Morgan's Faulkner-esque saga of one family's relationship to racing in The Sport of Kings, 2016. The last section, Sovereignty and Mercy, considers languages of sovereignty and animal life, and Toni Morrison's of mercy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. It's so exciting to be in conversation with you. I want to remind the folks who are out there to feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. I have many things I'm excited to ask Sharon about. I know you all do as well. So when you pose your questions in the Q&A box, I'll turn to them in a few minutes.
And I've just put up a picture from the MOVE archive of MOVE folks in the Powelton Village, front yard of the Powelton Village house.
So I'm someone who always thinks in terms of keywords, right? And so some of my interest is in some of the terms that you use and just inviting you to say more. I was struck by a moment in the beginning of your talk when you said that this project sort of began by thinking about what you called vocabularies of vulnerability. And as I was so Sharon shared the chapter about MOVE with me before this event. And I was really interested in hearing you say more about what this term vulnerability means. I was thinking about it in relationship to MOVE, but also in relationship to your larger project. I found myself thinking about the vulnerability that the blurring of the human-animal boundary binary produces, a kind of porousness to each other. But I also found myself thinking about folks like Patricia J. Williams, who has these moments when she really wants to think. In Alchemy of Race and Right, she has an incredible moment where she talks about how we need to give rights away, gives them to trees and history and air and chickens and foxes, and right. So we get this incredible vision of being intensely vulnerable to each other and with each other. So I wanted to ask you to say something about that, and also about a moment, and I'm so lucky because I got to read this also, but you have a wonderful moment in the version you sent me where you say, if I can quote you to you, my text is always already suspicious of the move to see Blackness as a kind of interminable vulnerability. And furthermore, a vulnerability that sustains a gendered being in the course of our opening up. And so I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the multiple valences of vulnerability for you, both with MOVE and in the larger project.
Well, thank you for that generous set of questions about keywords, Jennifer. This project was called Vocabularies of Vulnerability, and what I tried to stake out in that first sentence and then kind of dismissing it, right, and talking about my accident, is that I realized that I was writing this work and I thought I was going to talk about all the ways in which the Blackness can be broken, and then I became broken, and I realized that my brokenness was a chosen brokenness. I knew the minute I saw Petey that was not going to be the horse for me. And he knew the minute he saw me that I was not going to be the horse for him. But, we made a pact. Let's jump some fences. Let's see. And at the end, he kind of, he was, in many ways, I knew he was half Western horse, half hunt seat horse, and he didn't really know who he was. And he became vulnerable and he stepped into a divot in the field and lost his footing. And I was coming up and out of a canter. And so he felt me vulnerable. And since I didn't have a connection to him, he bucked me because, he's like, well, I can do this now and get you fully off while I'm freaked out about that hole in the ground, right? And so I realized that I had opened myself up and that to this being, and I was moving down a road to open myself up, willingly. And I know this sounds really, not necessarily Pollyanna-ish, but it's a very simple desire. I wanted to really think about the lives, like the folks in MOVE, of Black people, Black descended people, African descended people who have decided to make that step, have decided to be vulnerable to the animal, and also the kind of disapprobation that comes from that vulnerability, because that vulnerability is always already public in many ways, right? I also didn't want to think about Black life as always already being taken, because I don't think that necessarily solves the question of gender we're seeking to answer, because that is the question that, in my opinion, it's at the heart of Spiller's work and Mama's Baby. Like, who is this insurgent female subject? And I found that Blackness, that while Blackness might cohere in its relationship to state apparatus and other forms, it didn't seem to cohere theoretically as a, as female gender. There's always this slippage. So the book is always already muddy and muddled territory. And that's why its argument is peripatetic. I couldn't find a way to stitch it all together that made sense. So following Derrida's lead about the animal that therefore I am following, I actually follow, wherever the text takes me. Like, oh, I opened up the portal now to think about, perishment. Well, I'm going to talk about Heidegger here because it seems right. And oh, well, I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm much more interested in puppies. So I'm going to, I'm going to do that. And oh, there's a chimpanzee strike. Let me talk about that. I felt like the book was being articulated in this way. And I guess what I'm trying to say, and to speak to the vocabulary of vulnerability here, the book became vulnerable to its object, which was always already constantly out of reach for me. Something I think that Derrida says in that posthumous work, that Western philosophy isn't going to help that question, isn't going to answer that question. So I hope that starts us off at least.
Yeah, I love this idea of the book becoming vulnerable to its object, right? Because I think part of what you do in this talk is push us to think about Black feminism as a set of ethics, right? And there are moments when you gesture to methods. I think the phrase that you used was, your method is sniffing the ground, right? And so I found myself wondering, like, what are these moments where you're offering us a kind of blueprint for doing Black feminist scholarship that's grounded in a kind of ethic? But before I get to that, you mentioned spillers, and I want to talk about spillers. We could talk about spillers for hours, but
I know. Wait, let me take my tie off.
Pour a drink. So of course, spillers is so central to the work that you're doing here, and as you mentioned today, you talked about the kind of longstanding Black feminist engagement drawing from spillers and the question of flesh. So I wanted to push you to say more about this moment that we're in now as scholars, right? Where spillers, there's this kind of reinvestment in spillers, right? From scholars working out of a whole host of different traditions. I often tell my graduate students, like when I was in graduate school, we didn't read spillers, right? Just to remind them that the kind of investment in spillers emerges in a particular historical moment, right? And to ask them to probe this moment. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you see your engagement with spillers as key concepts, flesh, of course, what you talked about on gendering, also as in conversation with or in friction with other work that thinks with spillers in this moment. I was struck by a turn of phrase in the longer version that you sent me, where you described the quote, unstable trajectory of gender through modes of Blackness housed in the belly of pessimism. So, and what a wonderful turn of phrase. So I'm curious to hear how you see the ways in which you're engaging with spillers as related to or different from how she gets taken up by others right now.
Well, first and foremost, I think Black feminist work has a sustained ethical relationship to cisgendered women and women and femme identified women. That is the object of Black feminism. And I'm not sure if that's the proper object of Black feminism, but it is a gesture of care. So I want to let people know that, I have read my Butler, and I do know that, we're against proper objects, but I do believe that there is a gesture that Black feminism makes to think about the condition, right? And in many ways, Hortense Spiller's piece starts with the condition of Black women through naming, right? These are all the possibilities for us, and none of them speak to us. And here's why, right? Also, I want to thank Michael Awkward, who is my dissertation advisor at U of M, and all the folks, Michelle Johnson, Black feminists who were there, Kathy Cohen, and others, Barbara Ransby. We were all in graduate school at the same time, and Spiller's article just broke. And it was a watershed moment, right? For theory, for thinking about Blackness, for returning us to Fanon, who had been considered kind of off limits by, certain forms of feminism coming out of the early engagement in feminist scholarship with women of color texts, right? And so Spillers has always been on my mind, and it took me 10 years to really understand and grasp what she was talking about in that article. And so I think I began, I kept reading, works by, Sexton, Wilderson, and others. I would read work on Black pessimism, and I would see that they were using the word flesh, and they were understanding flesh in a particular way. And so instead of like actually having an argument for that, I just panicked. I was like, oh gosh, did I make a mistake? So I went back and I used that MLA paper as an occasion to really go back and say, was I off here? But I think there's something that Calvin Warren argues for at the end of Ontological Terror, and that's spirit, right? Which accounts for, which even in the belly of Black pessimism, there is not, I'm not talking about an out for this terrible situation. One of the things that Black pessimism acknowledges is that is just a world. And there are many other worlds. And so what I'm interested in this book is really thinking about those many other worlds that people of African descent tried to create. And I want to think about flesh as a possibility for an elemental relationship with gathering Blackness unto itself, right? Which doesn't necessarily hang itself on the possibilities enjoyed by the category of the human. So, my critique here is not necessarily of, a Black pessimism per se, but it is trying to take seriously what Black feminist discourse needs and wants to say. And I'm interested in that insurgent female subject. Who is she? And also at the same time, the drag of flesh is always the drag of reproduction. Laura Briggs tells us that all politics is reproductive politics. And, we have wanted to, feminists, we've been running away from reproduction for a long time. Spillers puts us in that moment constantly in that text, and problematically so. And so I wanted my book to try to consider, well, what do Black people do with reproduction when they have an opportunity to? And Move certainly did interesting things with reproduction.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you said that, and that we have this striking image on screen. I wanted to invite you to see more about Move. One of the things that, there's so much that's so fascinating in the chapter. I was struck by Move's conception of the communal, and thus its conceptions of property. And I wanted to ask you to say more about that, right? Because for me, as someone who's, I suppose, trained in law, I'm always interested in how children and animals are conventionally understood as property, right? And we have Move staking out a kind of different territory in their conception of what both the child and the animal are. We also have these moments in the longer version of the project where you talk quite a bit about Move's desire to view each other as belonging to each other, right? This is another moment, you can tell Patricia Williams is on my mind, right? When I think of her turn of phrase, owning the self in a disowned world, right? As her vision of a certain kind of freedom, which is both puzzling because it's about ownership, but it's about a different kind of relationship to ownership and property. And lastly, I was struck by the renaming that we see, right? Where name is also a connection to property. So we get the John Africa, right? We get the kind of
yes.
So I was wondering if you could say more about the promise of the communal and how the communal allowed folks in Move to sort of to reimagine what property could look and feel like in a new world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there's so much to unpack here in that chapter. So keep me on point, Jennifer, with the property. Make sure I have it down here, property and ownership. Make sure I come back to that. As a young child who went to what we called farm school, which was like a hippie Quaker school for misfits, in pretty much a multicultural classroom, interestingly enough, like the kind of classroom that people keep saying that they want, we had at that little Montessori school. And we also had lots of animals, we could ride horses. And when I discovered Move's work with animals, I felt like not such a queer kid after all. That I was moving towards something that had already been modeled for me, but because of the way in which our work is structured as intellectuals, that work was held off from me, right? And so when I saw this is my favorite picture, when I see the baby in the coat, and the dog's just chilling, and if you look over to the right, there's probably a rat or two running around, and they're making structures, they're involved in, everybody in the yard is part of the yard. and their own locomotion is just as important as your own locomotion. But I'll go to something. So the MOVE project sits in 2 iterations. Most people are interested in the events surrounding the Osage Avenue home and its bombing by the Philadelphia police on May 13th, 1985. And I was interested in the Powelton Village home. So this is the Powelton Village residence, and I'll just move through. I'll come back to that picture. This is what was in the archive, like at the last photo that I looked at, right? You know, that last photo you look at before you have to catch your plane and you think you're going to miss your plane because you keep saying, I got 1 more minute, 1 more minute. So the House of John Africa is built on the foundation of life. Long stand the House of John Africa. Long live revolution. Long live MOVE. But the being is this dog right here, right? So who welcomes us to this new MOVE home? Who are MOVE's children, right? It's something that they were constantly asked by police, by passersby. Their entire life was kind of an open text, right? They believed their practice was entirely ethical, and that they believed in the freedom of other beings and in life as a single referent. And life as a single referent cannot give itself over to property or ownership. Right? And I think that differs from what we might call the struggle for reproductive life, right? Or what we might call the struggle for the qualifiers we keep putting on life. I guess that's what I want to say, like unborn life. You know, I'm not necessarily, MOVE wasn't interested in qualifying life. It's a single referent from which we all draw existence. And they literally moved in that soup. And so their sense of being together, of, you know, understanding that the earth wasn't this space for them to cover up with concrete, you know, that animals weren't here for our entertainment or our enjoyment or our use, right? Just, you know, I wanted to focus on, and then I realized that, you know, not only is there, and to me, scholarship needs to be corrected. When people talk about animal liberation, they need to talk about MOVE because it comes before PETA. You know, and PETA is more, and we can get into it if we want to, but PETA is more interested in animal rights than they are in liberation. And I can talk a little bit more about my thoughts on that. But I was just fascinated by what MOVE was giving me in this book, in terms of an understanding that there's a possibility to live the way I would like to live. But that possibility does, yes, could and does mean death. And I wanted folks to take that seriously, that their work with animals is what brought about the occasion, right? That they were taken from this, many of them were taken, at least, you know, 11 were taken from us because of their stance about how to live. And I think that's important in forms of American pragmatism. I know somebody, I forget their name now, but I know someone's coming out with a book about MOVE's religious practice, which could be interesting, you know, for that pragmatist tradition.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I mean, I was so curious to hear more with the MOVE archive about how you are imagining the relationship between life and death as you see it there, right? Because I see so much of the work that you're doing here as helping us think through how MOVE is articulating and practicing in ethics of life, right? Like, so you at times will quote, you know, we're letting the animal just be. Our belief is life, right? There's a theory of living there. But, and here I'm reminded of your first book, there's a relationship between living life and death, right? That you want us, that I think you're asking us to think through. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about those connections for us.
Yeah, I think in a preliminary discussion, I had divulged that I was in conversation with Lisa Lowe once, and she asked me if the 3 books were like a trilogy, you know, of sorts. And I do think they take up, you know, I'm sure I get bored very quickly, and you know, I've always been that kid. You know, when my mom had to put 3 books in front of me to get me to sit still for more than a minute. And I every time I write a book, I want to learn something new. And so, but each book travels in a particular question, and the question is usually uncomfortable. So in many ways, it is, and my work, I see my work as quintessentially a Black feminist anti-racist practice. I am trying to stay in those uncomfortable moments, even when we're with ourselves, right? Because one of the things that, my grandmother taught me years ago is that in order to be a part of the Black community, and I think this is what Black feminism is, one has to have a healthy critique of that community and its belonging. And I feel like Mauve came along and just opened up a completely different way through their practice of living. And so, anyway, remind me of the last part of the question. And
you've said so many things that spark other questions for me. So I want to take you up on this idea of the Black feminist anti-racist practice that's at the heart of what I would say is everything you do, everything you've written, right? And so I want to ask you about two terms and how they appear in this book, or if they matter for the book. And the first is pleasure. And I ask you about that because I think one of the things you and I have shared over the years is our investment in placing pleasure squarely on the Black feminist theoretical and political agenda. So I wanted you to say how questions of pleasure, erotics, joy are part of this project. And I also wanted to invite you to say something about care, which I particularly think of because, there's a way in which care has become sort of the keyword of the day for Black studies, perhaps in part because of Christina Sharp's work, certainly amplified with COVID. And I think care often travels in Black studies in ways that feel to me apart from the kind of feminist critiques of the gendered logics of care that have grown and developed over the last, say, 40 years. So I'm curious about pleasure and care and what they mean for your project and for the kind of Black feminist ethics and anti-racist practice that you've developed.
An ethic. Once I realized I was like actually falling from PD, and that was going to be it for me. And then I got up and I thought I was okay, and then I tried to move my arm and I gestured to my trainer like, nope, whatever's over here was working before is not working. We have to go to the hospital. And I think it's in that moment, it was in the healing from that I realized I was going to get back on. And I had so many people, my neighbor Cranston, who, may rest in peace and power, used to flag me down on my horse, and he'd be like, in my truck going to the barn, and he'd be like, Sharon, he's like, where you going? I'm like, I'm going to go ride, Cranston. And he'd be like, you ain't a child anymore, right? And I'm like, Cranston, I said, you don't tell me what to do, right? And we would laugh, right? And I realized that I liked it. And even though there were moments both in my working life and in my personal life where my writing practices have gotten me into trouble in terms of people's understanding of what it is, what they are, what they mean. So I want to talk about pleasure, though, in another register. And that is that thinking about the fact that I was going to get back on, not because not because I wanted to overcome, right? I want to be a good writer because, I am not a very good writer. I have a pretty good seat, but I'm not like the best. But in seeking that pleasure, it opened up for me a world in which I understood that what I was doing didn't have anything to do with the kind of whiteness that people usually think the hunt seat represents. I was actually, the first race in the United States, I tell my students in my animal studies course all the time, was on the backs of 3 horses between the legs of 3 enslaved people of African descent in North Carolina. So instead of people asking me, why do you ride? I was just like, well, why do you ride? Because this is our sport. This is what we do. We were brought here to do this work. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that a Black feminist practice leads you to pleasure. And it seems very much like the argument that's been so influential from your book about pleasure. that one can find Black feminist praxis in these things that people understand, in these acts that people understand as wholly outside of those practices, or that they should be. And so I wanted to queerly read. I wanted to go in there. And then I realized, oh, I'm actually in a more normative position in terms of my Blackness and my relationship to horses than I ever even imagined for myself. And so the pleasure became an intellectual one. So that's one thing. And also as a queer scholar and as a someone who identifies as gender nonconforming but cisgendered female, I really take seriously pleasure. That I don't, that sentence you read from the book project, I don't want to see pleasure closed off from us because other people make it so. And I wanted to find Black subjects who choose vulnerability in order to make a point about how we should live, right? And the second thing is care. I followed the track of like a feminist ethics of care, which you can see in Kathy Rudy's, amazing book, Loving Animals, or you can see it obviously in Donna Haraway's work on Becoming With. That stretches all the way back to primate visions. And I was interested in this ethics of care, and particularly like in Vanessa Woods's work on the bonobos, mostly because of how we understand human being through, especially in primate studies, through this sense that, we're more like chimpanzees than we are bonobos. And so therefore we're an uncaring people, right? And how do we become more caring? How do we actually join the bonobos? How do we have sex when we disagree? Which I don't think anybody's going to be like, oh, that's a bad idea, right? How do we have sex what's the word? How do we have sex to settle our arguments as opposed to, kill one another, in order to settle? And so I think that these questions that came up through that conduit, which aren't necessarily considered in animal studies, right? Animal studies is a very male-oriented field, and I wanted to take those women who ride and train and work with animals seriously. And I also wanted to be taken seriously by them. And so this book has taken a long time to write because I had to spend 10 years writing and falling off and loving Annie and worrying and being with her and being kicked by her and all of those things in order to really, I wanted to have a relationship with an animal that was is larger than life, but also is would help me somehow, like I said, the object, right? I became vulnerable to the object of this book. And the object that I chose the most, the study, the being that I chose was clearly the horse. So I hope that care and pleasure, like how I work those here, makes sense.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I want to remind folks out there that you can post questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to turn to some of those questions, Sharon, and please, folks in the audience, feel free to keep putting your questions there. So Isabel asked, and I'm just going to read it as it was written. My question is, how, if at all, has the COVID pandemic found itself influencing this project? I'm thinking about the zoonotic nature of the COVID virus and how it requires a rethinking of our relationship, not only to animals, but to the land and spaces that we share with other lives, human, animal, and plant. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for that question. And my answer is going to be really quick and simple. This book I've been writing this book toward this moment. And I feel like this book, if I wanted to finish this book, I wanted to have a book every 6 years. I had this thing, right? And clearly that didn't happen. So I started writing this book in like 2007, really, and in the course of that time, The Erotic Life of Racism was published in 2012. And I wanted to finish this by 2018, but I think it would have missed its mark entirely. I feel like this moment right now is at what we consider to be the boundary of hum animal. We have a planet that needs our attention. Human being needs to sit down and think about how we are going to consider other species. And also human being needs to think about itself as a species, doesn't have a real we don't have a very big consciousness around that. And I want this book to contribute to that thinking by understanding how we have maybe misunderstood or not really expanded our animal studies lens as widely as we can.
Thank you for that. I think that the next question builds off of that. So the audience member asks, I was wondering how you might or might not connect this work about the hum-animal distinction to Mel Chen's work on animacies and mappings of the affective constitution of inanimate objects. Do you think there's something to say about not just the hum-animal divergence, but the perceived life, non-life distinction in relation to the theories you have been engaging with?
Oh, absolutely. I actually take up Mel Chen's work when I look at circumspections of an equestrian statue. And, Mel Chen takes the animacies, from a particular like linguistic, a work in linguistics, right? But I think that I look at the new materialisms. I look at the extent to which almost all the boundaries between ourselves and other beings, regardless of whether we perceive them as beings or not, are being questioned in scholarship. There's, Dunning's work on Black to Nature. Everyone is coming out with something right now that really is thinking elementally about our existence in this world, and finally I feel like it's the dark crystal. Skeksis don't like gelflings, right? But they're actually one and the same being, right? It's always good to get in those early Jim Henson puppet movies. Right?
Yeah. So the next question, Sharon, sort of moves us in a different direction. This is a question from Heather, who asks, I would love to hear more about how you're considering the relationship between hum-animal relations, perhaps in conflict with the dominance of white-owned livestock corporations in the South in particular, and especially in relation to Black counter-geographies and histories. So
that last part again, the first part again?
Yeah, sorry. This is the joys of Zoom.
I know, right?
Let me read it again. I would love to hear more about how you're considering the relationship between hum-animal relations, perhaps in conflict with the dominance of white-owned livestock corporations in the South in particular, especially in relation to Black counter-geographies and histories.
Okay, yes. Well, I'm not, at one point in this book, I was going to talk about North Carolina pigs in particular. But I do most of that work, that scholarly work, in my teaching, and my students pursue projects. And so I wasn't necessarily, I decided that I get really close to it in thinking about Charles Burnett's film, Killer of Sheep. And so I think so while I don't really deal with dominant white-owned, right, I want to find the right word. Dominant white-owned spaces where animals are kept, right, or contained, right? I was interested in how, especially I'll just use the, part of the argument for the film, Burnett's film, Killer of Sheep, which I think is 1978. And I was interested in the ways in which we think about, in that movie, we think about the sheep as kind of a metaphor, right, for Stan's inability to get anywhere on the hamster wheel that is, global capitalism, right? And his work on the killing floor, right, of a factory. But one of the things that I noted from reviews of the film, and also just from looking at an oral history from Burnett, that his film, The Horse, is 73 and Killer Sheep is 78. Burnett and a whole host of Black filmmakers in the LA Rebellion were really interested in and concerned with animal life. And to look at that film and think of the sheep, right? Because at the end of the film, the brilliance of that film is at the end of Killer of Sheep, we realize that actually the title character Stan is the killer of sheep, literally. He's the kill shot person for the slaughterhouse. And so his depression in the film, besides global capital, might actually have to also do, in addition to global capital, with killing animals. And so I think it's really one of the first films that really takes a stark look at Black family life, you know, and the animal comes up over and over again in that film, not just in the scenes of the slaughterhouse, but also that wonderful picture of his daughter with her finger in her mouth with the dog face on, just staring at him, you know. And I love that, you know, love Burnett's cuts and his takes are long. You get to enjoy, right? So in a film about animal slaughter, you also have these long takes where you get to enjoy Black bodies at their pleasure, right? And also see the full spectrum of Black emotion, right? And so one of the things that we don't really think about is we don't really think about the relationship that Black bodies had to slaughterhouses in the 70s and 80s. You know, people are usually you know, this is like what I'll call the post-PETA kind of reckoning that we have to do in animal studies to kind of really get people to understand that Black folks working in those slaughterhouses had something to say about them. So I hope that this answers your question about the hum-animal relation, because I feel like a Black filmmaker, even Dick Gregory, you know, who I wasn't able to work on for this book because of COVID, but there's Black figures across the country, but especially in that moment in Los Angeles, really thinking through hum-animal relation.
On this idea, Sharon, of the kind of post-PETA reckoning, to use the phrase you just used, one audience member asked if you would say more about the difference for you between a kind of animal rights framework and a liberation framework that you've seen MOVE advancing, and how you situate your work in or against, or maybe both, animal studies.
Right. I want to just say thank you. The audience has been so generous. Thanks to all of you for these questions. And if there's something I don't answer, just come back around. But thank you in particular for that question about PETA. I feel that we need to respect liberation struggles for what they are. And a rights struggle is, you know, to have your object be to liberate a being, right, is very different than having your lived circumstance change by living with that being. And so that's, to me, that is the ethic, that is the care, that is the Black feminist moment in MOVE's work for me as a Black feminist, you know, and thinking about the relationship to animal life. MOVE wasn't interested in taking those animals, right, and putting them somewhere. You know, MOVE is interested in recalibrating the way we live, even though they know that the recalibration of the way we live is going to get them into trouble. You know, and there's a wonderful moment where I think it's Lorraine Cox says in the hearing, she says, in the beginning, and I wish I had the quote before me, and I'd wanted to take it out and I forgot. In the beginning, MOVE were some of the happiest, most loving people you ever want to meet. And the way she says it and starts crying during the hearing, if you listen to I went in the archive, you can, you know, hear the clip. It's also in the movie about the bombing of the Osage Avenue house. It just, you know, that they had this dream and they just went about it thinking like, this is great, you know, that you do when you're, you know, when you're idealistic and you think you can change the world. And that they were beaten, you know, she said they were beaten by the cops and corralled so often, you know, that it broke them.
So I have a few questions that are going to move us in different directions, but that's fun. One asks, how can our thinking about our hum-animal connections unsettle our institutional identities or locations as academics in the increasingly precarious humanities in the neoliberal academy, especially for those of us in PWIs?
Oh, that's a good question. I think focusing on hum animal life as opposed to difference creates a space for collaboration and rethinking what we cannot know. Because, you know, in an institutional setting where we're always already, you know, procuring knowledges, we're often unsettled by what we do not know or cannot know. And I feel like that's what animal studies were. I finally wanted to go into the zone of things I cannot possibly know. Right. And I feel like that's, you know, you might not know, you might not be able to communicate with an other. You might not know how they feel, but you can try. And, you know, this struggle for animal liberation that MOVE tried, it's enormous. It just blows my mind that they did that. And at such great cost. You know, they were the ones protesting zoos and circuses. You know, and I just want them to get their due. I want people to recognize that this thing that happened in Philadelphia was, quite frankly, all of it. So I feel like I feel like in order to do deep diversity work on campus, you have to start from staying in an uncomfortable place. And for academics, that's hard for us because we think we can know. So what would happen with our projects if we started from the space of not knowing and without an endpoint? If we stayed in that moment with one another long enough to change us. So I think that's the possibility that's opened up institutionally for this hum animal. And it's supposed to be hum animal if you think of human, but I'm not thinking human. I'm thinking of a hum, a vibration.
One of the things you said beautifully earlier in your opening remarks that really sort of stuck with me was that part of what your project opens up is questions about what constitutes the known world, right? And so there are questions about what can we know, what can't we know, and I would even add what is not ours to know, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think you did a really amazing job sort of framing that as a political question, as a theoretical question, and as an ethical question. So there's two sort of MOVE specific questions that I'm going to pair, Sharon.
Sure.
So one was an invitation to say something about the place of either spirituality or religion or both in conception of life and being. And the second was an invitation to say a little bit more, if you'd like, about MOVE as a kind of Philadelphia story, or to say more about the context in which MOVE emerged.
I mean, well, first I'll just take the second question. I mean, you know, the city of liberation, Liberty Bell, I mean, Philly, you know, I mean, the vibe is already there. And I'm not saying that I believe in Philadelphia as a city of liberation. Let's be clear. I think everyone here knows how I feel about that 1776 moment as an African descended subject. But it seems to me, it is definitely a Philadelphia story. I mean, their presence in the Politan Village neighborhood, which is a predominantly changing, newly gentrifying area of the city, where white folks were living, where, Black folks were kind of like behind them and on the sides, and where white folks who, I have pictures of the white people who went to City Hall to complain about them, and had signs holding, "We are MOVE's victims," right? So definitely, the book doesn't necessarily touch upon Philly history, so much, but obviously I was connected to that Philly history through my family because that's where my cousins lived for a long time. And I remember driving to Philadelphia and seeing a scene, everybody knows the infamous Frank Rizzo, and seeing a bulletin, a billboard. A bulletin board. I wish it were a bulletin board, but a billboard. And it said, vote for Rizzo and keep the beep in their place. And I remember being in the car so vividly with my mom and saying, asking her, I'm like, can you say that, Mom? How did they put that up there? you know, and the whole car just exploding with, like, you know, my uncles and my aunts. And it was during that time in the 70s when we all got into station wagons and barreled down I-95 without seatbelts, kids undulating from the back of the big paneled station wagon to the front and back again, right? I loved that time. There must have been 8 kids in the car, 4 adults. I don't know how we all got in there, but we did, on the way to Philly, right? And so that's the first part of the question. And the other part of the question talks about move. What's the first part, Jennifer, if you can remind me?
Yeah, it was an invitation to say more about spirituality and or religion.
Yes. Well, like I said, yeah, there's a book coming out on spirituality and religion. And, you know, there's so many, I mean, I move in so many different directions in the book. At a certain point, I just had to cut it off. So I gesture toward, I want to respect their notion of life, but I don't spend a lot of time in the book, or any time really. I do find actually, and Jennifer read the longer version, that this concept of life actually has a corollary in St. Louis Black liberation struggles, right? That everyone was, you know, and I bet you if I went and did the work, I would see life across a pantheon. And you see it in Dick Gregory's work, you know, that this idea, this movement for life. And I think that's why Black Lives Matter, you know, that emblematic statement has a history, has a spiritual relationship to modes of Black thought that I hope will be taken seriously by people. You know, it's not just the way in which people bandy about, you know, the use of the term, you know, Blue Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, you know, as if there's an opposite, you know, Blue Lives Matter doesn't have the same kind of history that Black Lives Matter has. You know, and that when Black people name themselves, we name ourselves in relationship to these histories that we've traveled through. And there needs to be some respect for that. So I don't do the spiritual or religious work. I wish I had time, but I'm definitely aware that they have a spiritual practice, and they are in many ways, you know, religiously oriented group, definitely. I see that.
We have a question from the wonderful Sarah Cervenak about the book itself. She asks, what role do images play in the book? Is there a way that they open something in the book connected to not knowing?
Oh, yes. Yes. I'm so glad you asked that. Hello, Sarah. I'm so glad you asked that question. Of course, now I went to the wrong one. This is one. I mean, you know, doing research, you know, in an archive on a group of African descendant people who have been so maligned, and who have like shown forms of like resilience and love that are just incredible, just lays you low. And this was an image on my second day. This is a police officer holding on to one of the moved children after the destruction of, you know, on the eve of the destruction of the Powelton Village house. All the children were taken by DFS. I love this shot. There's, you know, she's not looking at the camera. It's almost, she's refusing to look at the camera because she knows the camera wants something from her, it seems. The child is, you know, and, you know, the COVID caught me, or, you know, I'm still going to be doing some research this summer, or try to find out who this woman is so I can use her name. I can probably find it from the police rolls. You know, this is a policewoman from Philly. So images do play a lot. I have another image from Kurt Wimmer's film Equilibrium of Kristen Bale, and Taye Diggs is in the film. And at one point, Christian Bale is holding up a puppy, and Taye Diggs is in the background of that shot, blurred, right? And then, of course, there are the scenes of the foreground and the background scenes, both blurred, of Northrop Nay Platt's near hanging in 12 Years a Slave. So you're right, images do serve to remark upon what can't be known. And also there's obviously, when I get to the horses, there's work from Carrie Mae Weems and Troy, paintings of horses and black subjects.
Thank you, Sharon. We have another question about the university, sort of piggybacking on the previous question. So this one says, I'd be grateful to hear more about the university as a site of non-knowledge production. I'm teaching graduate students a course that angles toward thinking social transformation through De Silva, Mbembe, Winter, and Octavia Butler's parable. We've struggled with the need for a new kind of scripture, earthseed, and the need somehow to write into a non-taxonomy, non-categorization. I'd love to hear more about how we write, teach, think against knowledge as entrapment and enclosure. I'd love to hear you say more about that as one future for the humanities.
Oh, wow. That's, I want to say that's a great question. That's your project. I mean, I want you to go write that book. That's amazing. No, but to take your query, seriously, I feel like the work that I do in the book is trying to open up that space of that, what we cannot know. And sometimes what we cannot know is a question we cannot ask, is a question that's not polite. And I have very impolite questions across the 3 books that, the two monographs that I have out already, and this one. And the impolite question here is, should you take the overseer's whip? It's not a fun question. It's not one that I would like to consider, but reading Northup's narrative and then having watched the McQueen film, the question I have is, I'm like, does he have to whip Patsy? Must he whip Patsy? And this is the precarious position, right? This right here is the precarious position. The precarious position is in the question you can't ask that reflects upon the Black female insurgent self, right? And so I feel like that, I'm thinking of Earthseed, not just as a concept in Butler, but obviously, Earthseed in Durham, right? I'm thinking of North Star Church of the Arts, that I feel like those spaces of knowledge are already being created. Durham, the triangle is a nexus for this, I would call, I'm thinking of Michelle Lanier's work and others, it's really a nexus of Black futures and Black future work, pay Black farmers, right? So I feel that if we attach ourselves to those movements, then the university comes out of itself. As opposed to, we would like you to come in and talk to us about what you're doing. I think modes of extraction in terms of intellectual work are have been challenged for the last decade. And I think the next phase is to not think through extraction, but to think with.
Thank you for that, Sharon. We have time for probably 2 or 3 more questions. This one is from Kim Lam, who asks, or who writes, I was struck by the return to the significance of language in Professor Holland's talk, the meta commentary on writing, the quote from Lord, the image of the move house and the sign in front of it. How did language figure into Move's reimagining of belonging and vulnerability?
Great question. Great question. I feel, well, they had, a set of guidelines or principles, and they lived by those guidelines or principles. And in Move lore, folks say, it burned in the Osage bombing, that manuscript. Some folks say it doesn't exist. Other folks say folks still have it. I'm wondering whether someone has come across it, for this book on religion and spirituality and Move, because it would seem to be necessary for that. But I think that there's a wonderful moment in a WPIX, which is a public, I think it's a PIX, WPIX, a public television affiliate. They do a kind of short community documentary on Move. And these 2 white subjects come upon the move house, and one of their questions is, who's the father of those, who's the father of those children? Right? He goes, and then the other question they ask, even before that is, I forget, what you have to have the white subjects seem to be frustrated. You have to have, and clearly the filmmaker has come to the conversation late, right? There's clearly been going back and forth. And so the part that we can see in the full video that I saw while I was in the archive is them asking, well, you have to have like a philosophy. You have to have some kind of guidelines for this. And the response of one of the MOVE members is life. And you should, I just love that moment, because in that moment, he talks about life, it's a single referent. That's it. That's what we're trying to do. We're taking what they're doing is they filmed them taking cement off the sidewalk, and the MOVE members are, removing the cement, and the person was like, what are you doing? And they're like, Mother Earth, we don't need this cement here. We're going to plant some flowers, maybe plant some food, we're going to just let it be beautiful. Right. And so, in that kind of the kind of work that they did around in that neighborhood, and how there was nothing that they did that didn't have a practice attached to it. And I think that's the way in which MOVE changed language. Right? That you couldn't say something without having a practice attached to it. So, I was trying to think of one other thing too that I remember recalling from the archive, but it just escaped me. But I can come back to more. But I think that that MOVE reoriented their space by saying to people, like, maybe no one had ever considered that puppy mills were bad. But they couldn't challenge the word puppy mill, the words puppy mill, without actually protesting and being there. So, their consciousness raising was intense. So that's what I would say in terms of moods and language.
Thank you for that, Sharon. So I'm going to ask you two more before we head off and enjoy this beautiful day, for those of us who are in Durham. So one question is about images. One is this image that you're showing now, and then the image you showed a few minutes ago of the police officer holding the child. And this person asks you to say more about the figure of the child for MOVE. A number of the images you include feature children. What did children mean for MOVE? What is the place of children and reproduction more broadly in their insurgent politics?
Yeah, they all belong to one another in terms of their bringing up children. And so their relationship, their children were often naked in the yard. They ate a raw diet. And the way in which, one of the things that you see in the popular, in the press, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Inquirer, and even in the New York Times, is folks saying, DFS folks who encountered MOVE children saying to themselves, when we got the kids, we thought they were going to be one way, but these kids were thoroughly loved. You could tell. You can tell when a child comes that they've been through hell. And that wasn't, even with all the police stuff going on, that wasn't the MOVE children. And that was remarked upon across several, over like 2 or 3 years, across several DFS folks. They thought of children and animals and life as one foundational whole. There was no distinction between the naked dog in the yard and the naked child. There was no, it's hard to describe, the scenes. I can imagine, someone looking on those scenes and going like, put some clothes on those children. That yard is dirty. all of the ways in which being and becoming were, I guess, one of the things I love about thinking through moves, actions, is that normally we would think that folks who live in a dwelling and want to radically change the way we live, foist that living onto others and it becomes harmful. And this wasn't necessarily what happened with Move Children. You see the long interview with one of the survivors of the Osage bombing. And they try to get him to talk about how bad it was. And he just can't bring, it's so painful. He doesn't understand what they're talking about. And I'm not saying that there wasn't strife in the organization, and that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not trying to do a celebratory take on Move. I'm trying to understand their philosophy of being together, hum animal being together. And I feel that the relationship that they had to their children was threatening for a society who could only think of Black children as being managed by the state.
Thank you for that, Sharon. So I'm going to ask you one last question, which comes to us from Kevin Henderson, who says, I'm really intrigued by Dr. Holland's invocation of the Heideggerian distinction between humans who die and animals that perish, and the question of whether Black people die or perish. To perish is always intransitive, unable to pick up a direct object or transfer its actions to others in English, while to die can be transitive or intransitive. Thus, grammatically, the ability to have an object is built into and or excluded into these keywords. Can you say more about this distinction in relationship to Jennifer Nash's comments about animals and children as legal property and the history of Black bodies as property? The subject-verb-object relations are really interesting here. Can you say more about how you're thinking about grammars of race, vulnerability, and property in relationship to the differences between dying and perishing?
Right. Well, one of the things that I see that Edward P. Jones is doing in The Known World is there's I don't have time to read it, but there's a passage where the insurance agent comes to a character in the novel and is going to offer them insurance for the perishment of their property, slave or otherwise. And so one of the things that, and the older iteration of the book thought of itself as moving down the road of perishment versus dying, in a way of being fully, what's the word for it? In the way of being fully able to understand that, one's death, right? And being, in a sense, taken. And I found that I didn't want to necessarily do that investment, but then to move down that road. But then I came upon The Known World, and in The Known World, this idea of perishment of property, enslaved or otherwise, Jones is tweaking and he's tweaking the relationship between enslaved or otherwise, between animate and inanimate property, right? And what Jones is giving us in that text is a way to see the extent to which the slaveocracy has conditioned everything that's possible, right? Conditioned everything that's possible in that moment. And so when the insurance agent is going to insure, life from perishment, the insurance agent is then conflating modes of Black life with modes of life modes of Black life in enslavement, modes of Black life in freedom with all other kinds of living. And I don't have time to read it. It's a fascinating passage. And so I was caught up with the extent to which, and this is what I draw upon again when I get to this horseflesh section, I was less interested, although there's a part in the text where I sleep with Heidegger, where I actually think about myself as kind of like it's an interesting section where I take on some of his principles in that work that animal studies people focus on. But when I get to horseflesh, I think about the way in which these vocabularies of slavery, breeding, husbandry, selling and buying of flesh are so ubiquitous in the horse world. And the extent to which that universe is inherited, that modes of being as property is inherited by us and practiced by us. It's not something that we kind of left behind, right? I mean, that's Christina Sharp's work, right? That's the wake, right? That we ride horses and participate in barn culture and horse flesh under the pressure of all of those leftovers from that time. So.
Thank you, Sharon. On behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for your tremendous generosity with your time and your brilliance. If we were all in a room, you would hear us clapping right now. So I hope you feel it, even though you don't hear it. And for those of you who are in the audience, we hope you will join us next week for Shatima Threadcraft's talk. And thank you again. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.